All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Joshua Patchworth, and thank you all very much for being here today. For those of you in the room, and then for any of you joining us via live stream, welcome as well. I am here speaking to you as the director of the Gerber Institute for Catholic Studies here on campus. And the Institute's mission is to integrate Catholic tradition with all the different disciplines across the university to enrich our Catholic identity and help people grow in their understanding of the intersection between our faith and all the other aspects of our life. And part of what we're doing this year at the Gerber Institute is very happily, once again, co-sponsoring with the diocese and the St. Thomas More Society this year's celebration of the Red Mass. So this evening, down at the cathedral, there will be the Red Mass, which is an annual Mass to honor and to pray for those in the fields of law and jurisprudence. And so tonight's keynote speaker following the Red Mass is going to be Father Paul Scalia, and we are very honored to have him joining us here today as well. So Father Scalia grew up in the Diocese of Arlington, where he is now a priest, and he went and studied at Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, and then went to Rome and studied both at the Gregorian University and the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. For those of you who know a little about theology and those different pontifical academies, that's kind of like going to Harvard and Yale, right? So he kind of has the two main camps under his belt. Since then, he has done a great deal of work following his ordination in 1996. In his diocese, he's held a variety of positions and is currently pastor of St. James and still Episcopal vicar for the clergy and directing the permanent diaconate program. In his larger public life, Father Scalia is a very prominent and sought-after commentator on all sorts of issues at the intersection between faith and culture and society. He's also the author of several books, including That Nothing May Be Lost, Reflections on Catholic Doctrine and Devotion, and Sermons in Times of Crisis, 12 Homilies to Stir Your Soul. So we are very pleased to have Father Scalia able to join us here today. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you. And I hate to do this to my host, especially since he asked me beforehand about the curriculum vitae that he was reading from, and I forgot to correct one thing. I'm credited in the curriculum vitae that's on our diocesan website with authoring the book Sermons in Times of Crisis. And I encourage you to buy it because I get money from it. No, because it's actually a wonderful book. But I didn't write any of the sermons in it. So I just edited them and collected them. And so if you purchase that book, which I encourage you to do, you'll be disappointed because it's sermons from, you have to settle for St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, John Henry Newman, and so, but it's still worth it, right? Okay. So thank you for the introduction, for welcoming me here this afternoon. I'm actually very grateful to have a trip out to the Heartland in September of a presidential election year. Okay, it's nice to get away from or outside of what I call the DC radius blast. You know, get out of that area. And this afternoon, I'd like to reflect on something that I think is very important and timely in our nation, and that is unity and diversity, and what in particular our Catholic faith brings to that discussion. And the situation probably doesn't need any explanation, but I mean, it's obvious that we have some deep divides in our nation, and some of them, many of them self-inflicted, others sort of inherited from the human condition. And I think that's one thing that we should call to mind at the very beginning, that when we encounter the division in any society, including our own, we have to recognize that this is not the first time that people have encountered it, and that the divisions we encounter are a legacy of sin. In the narrative, in the first several chapters of Genesis, we hear of the first effects of original sin, and then how they sort of echo into other places in our experience, in the human experience. And so the first effect of original sin is of course separation from God. What do Adam and Eve do first? They hide themselves, which is actually a very funny image, if you think about it, that they're going to hide behind the tree. He'll never find me there. It's kind of like toddlers trying to do that from their parents. So that's that. There's a first alienation from God, and that alienation leads to all of the others, including the ones that we see today. And again, getting back to Genesis, if we recall that Adam and Eve make aprons or out of fig leaves. If you've ever seen a fig tree and fig leaves, they're very big leaves. So if you're in need of clothes in a hurry, they're the right thing for you. And that speaks of an alienation that sin has introduced into our very being. That before sin, Adam and Eve were naked without shame. There was a harmony between body and soul. After sin, they're alienated from even their own bodies. They are literally not comfortable in their own skin. And then there's an alienation between them. What happens? God says, why did you do this? You've eaten then of the tree I told you not to eat of. And what does Adam do? He blames Eve. And by extension, he blames God. In the narrative, he says, it was the woman whom you put here with me. I was fine. I had a lot of yard work to do, and it was your bright idea. And so there's this alienation between man and woman, a lack of harmony. It's so contrary to what we hear before the sin of Adam and Eve, which is Adam looks upon her and he bursts into a song of praise. This one is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And then we see in the following chapters, well, even already still in the third chapter, an alienation from creation. Now work is frustrating, and the earth, which was intended to bring forth food and fruit and produce for man, now there's a frustration involved there. And then in the story of Cain and Abel, we encounter a division or an alienation between brothers. And then in the account of the Tower of Babel, a division among nations. So the divisions that we see today really proceed from that. They're nothing new in the world, which doesn't mean that we just throw up our hands and do nothing about it, but it does help us to situate it properly. And in the Second Vatican Council, it speak very clearly that the divisions and the suffering we see are, first of all, interior to us, because that primary alienation is the alienation that we experience within ourselves, and that comes from the alienation from God himself. And so what we see today, of course, is the polarization of different groups and different ethnicities or demographics or socioeconomic groups sort of squaring off against one another. And, at my parish in Falls Church, we have two African priests in residence, one from Cameroon and one from Ghana. And it's fascinating to get their perspective because to them, they don't really see our current crises in terms of black and white. in terms of white and African Americans or Hispanics or whatever else, because in their countries they encounter sort of prejudices and among Africans. They see that in their own country, and it's not necessarily racial. It's probably tribal, and so it's fascinating to hear their perspective on this, and so that's what we're encountering now. And there's a lot of talk, of course, about the need for diversity, and that's fair enough. There will be diversity, right? And the question is, what kind? We are diverse as human persons. The question for us then is, well, what kind of diversity will we have? Will we have a diversity that's kind of squaring off against one another, and we just say, well, you have your sphere and I have mine, and let's just agree to that? Or will it be a diversity that also speaks of a unity? And that really is the question. There's a danger of advocating a diversity that doesn't have a principle of unity. Without a principle of unity, the diversity will become conflict. Or at best, it's just no interaction with one another. And so we have to be careful when we talk about diversity, we don't fall into that trap. And there's a mindset about our freedom that a mistaken mindset that I think feeds into this, and that is the notion that I am free to do what I want so long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. And this is a very bad understanding of freedom. Because it admits of no possibility of community. If the only thing that we have in common is an agreement not to harm one another, that's thin gruel, isn't it? That's not really a good basis for a society, for bringing people together in some sort of common life. It doesn't help what we call the common good. So, how do we bring about that unity? And this gets to sort of the second part of my title of the talk, which is how the Catholic and Catholicism can heal divisions in our society. So let me say a couple of words about that term Catholic, which means universal. And so the Catholic Church is universal in several respects. In the most immediate and literal term, the Catholic Church is universal because we're all over the world, right? Even more than McDonald's. We are, in every town and village and nation, and it always kind of amuses me when in the confessional people try to get out of, they say, well, I missed Mass. I say, well, why'd you miss Mass? Well, I couldn't find a church. I'm like, we're the Catholic Church. Like, we're all over the place. Come on. And so we are universal in that way. Some years ago, he wasn't the ambassador, but we didn't have an ambassador at that time. But Frank Shakespeare was his name. He's a great man, and he was, I don't know what level of representative he would have been to the Holy See, but he made the observation that the Holy See, the Vatican, was a great listening spot for the world, because the Pope has representatives in every country. and so so every country sort of has a vested interest in being on good terms because of that universal reach. And the universal reach, of course, is not primarily for diplomatic reasons. It's for reasons of care of souls and proclaiming the gospel. The Church is universal in the sense that she teaches all truths necessary for salvation. Not all scientific truths, not all medical truths, but everything true necessary for salvation we find in the Church's teaching. And the Church is universal in the sense that within the Church we find forgiveness for all sins. No sins are beyond the scope of the Church to forgive. But I'd like to focus on another dimension of the concept of universal, because when we talk about the church as universal, and especially about the church's teachings and her people as universal, it doesn't mean just everybody together, like thrown into a box, or it doesn't mean like, your garage or your attic, which needs to be organized, or, more likely just purged of things that you don't need, right? I mean, we all have that element in our lives, or things are just kind of thrown in. Maybe it's on your computer. You've got, files that are just kind of thrown together. They need to be organized. That's not how we should understand the church as universal. The word universal is, versa uni. It is everything turned to the one. And so when we talk about the universality of the church in her teaching and in her people, it means that there is a unifying principle. It's not just everybody gathered together with no organizing or unifying principle. It is everybody gathered together because of this principle of salvation, of the gospel, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. It is rooted in the truth of the gospel. That is what makes many people one. And the truths that we have are not just kind of truths that have no relation to one another, but actually they form an organic whole. And again, there is a unifying principle throughout all of them. And so that is how we should understand the word Catholic. So the church should show society authentic diversity in unity, which is really what it means to be Catholic. It should show that, first of all, by example. And in order to bore you, I've selected various paragraphs from the Catechism. And by the way, the masks, I think we all agree, the masks are very off-putting, okay? Because I don't know if people are, are smiling or they're, right? So there's a guy in the airport with a big smiley face on his mask, right? And we're all standing in line waiting, between flights. And somebody looked at him and said, it doesn't feel like that right now, So, but the unity of the church is supposed to be reflective of the Trinity, which means this is not a unity and a diversity of human endeavor, of human making. It's not man-made. So the Catechism says the church is one because of her source. The highest exemplar and source of this mystery is the unity in the Trinity of persons, of one God, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's an amazing statement, that the church is to be a reflection of what we find in the inner life of God. That in God himself, you have oneness, and of course you have a Trinity. And these two things in God do not contradict each other. This is a highest dogma of our faith. And it's, this point in the Catechism that the Catechism is making is that unity and diversity, if you will, in the Trinity is supposed to be sort of reflected. The church is to be an image of that. And so in the church, we should find oneness, and unfortunately we don't always. There are divisions. But at the same time, we should find a diversity. And that, of course, is precisely what we do find. So the Catechism goes on. From the beginning, this one church has been marked by great diversity, which comes from both the variety of God's gifts and the diversity of those who receive them. And so God gives his gifts differently. No two of us have received the same gift. Each one of us is created precisely because God wanted there to be you, and not you as a cheap imitation of the other person, right? Each of us is created as an end in himself or herself, and each of us is given different gifts, natural gifts, spiritual gifts. So there's diversity of God's gifts and a diversity of those who receive them, both individually and according to culture. Within the unity of the people of God, a multiplicity of peoples and cultures is gathered together. And this is what St. Paul faces in the very first years of the church. Very first years of the church are characterized by the church going out from Jerusalem to the rest of the world. And not just, we're familiar in the Acts of the Apostles, we're familiar with going out to the Greek world, but the apostles went to Egypt, and they went east to India, and they went all over and encountered different cultures and brought the one faith there. And so the struggle very early on was, how do we preserve the one faith and the unity of the church, but without compromising the diversity? And throughout the church's history, there's always been a little bit of tension and sometimes a tug of war on this. But throughout the church's history, this has produced, different liturgical rites. The Eastern churches, and then the Latin church, and in a different expression of things. And again, this is why it's so wonderful to have these African students in my parish, because they bring a view of things which has both a oneness, where we don't believe anything differently than one another, but at the same time a diversity. Their sort of expression of things and is a little different, and their experience of things. When I became pastor, I received some complaints that the homilies of one of the priests were too long. And now, first of all, Americans are quick to complain that homilies are too long. All right, but second, he's from Cameroon, and there, people walk for hours to go to Mass. Your homily better be long, right? They spend all day getting there. If you give like a 15-minute homily, which in America would be long, they're going to say, "What? I spent 2 hours on the road. That's all you got?" And so it's a very different experience of things. And in my parish, it's fascinating. We have so many different cultures in this one parish. Northern Virginia is a very diverse area. Somebody mentioned to me the other day, said, "Do you have any lectors that don't have accents?" And they weren't talking about like a Southern accent, but we have one young woman, her name is Princess, and I don't know what nation she's from Africa. I don't know which nation. She has the most beautiful voice, and she gets up in her native sort of garb and does reading. It's really astounding. And then, we've got, Filipinos and Asians, and a guy did a reading the other day. I have no idea where he's from. I couldn't place the accent. But there's this diversity there that really should be found within the church. Among the church's members, there are different gifts, offices, conditions, and ways of life. And so this is what we ought to find in the church. I talked about the early church, and this is, St. Paul's kind of trying to address this at the very beginning. The medieval church is interesting to consider as well, because the medieval church, stretching from Sicily to Scotland, from the Atlantic all the way to Poland, if not farther east, and you had all of these different cultures, and they are very different cultures, with understanding that they were united by a common faith, and that didn't always stop them from fighting with each other, but and that obviously is not good, but it's fascinating because there was this common understanding about things and about how even their fighting should be done. Now we want to have that unity and diversity without the fighting. So this is, I think, the example that the church should provide to the world. There is unity in the truths that we believe. There is unity in the sacraments that we have, and in the governance. Right? These are the three classic things. We find unity in those things, and within those things, we are allowed a great diversity, as the church throughout the world demonstrates, and even as I would say, not only my parish, but I think most parishes in Northern Virginia demonstrate. Another contribution that the church brings is the unceasing articulation of the truth of the human person. One of the dangers is to lose sight of our common human nature. It is on this basis that our nation was founded, by imperfect men who lived imperfectly and applied their own principles imperfectly. But that doesn't take away the truth of the principles that they enunciated. When they speak of certain rights being inalienable, they are recognizing a common human nature that serves as the basis of a just society. And it's on the basis of that truth that Abraham Lincoln waged a war. He didn't chuck the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. He actually used those as instruments to make his case. And Martin Luther King, his "I Have a Dream" speech, which a couple months ago I listened to on YouTube, which is, I mean, one of the great gifts of the internet, right? You can listen to it, and it's still just one of the most stirring speeches I've ever heard. And his argument in that speech is based on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that, I mean, and just by the way, the way he speaks it is amazing. You know, I mean, he's a man who just, he could preach. His whole advocacy for reform was not one of getting rid of the founding principles of our nation, but of, as he said, you know, holding the current generation true to them, and bringing the promissory note, as he says, and now wanting it to be cashed in effect. That shared human nature and that understanding of the human person that the church articulates needs to serve as the basis of society. Or to put it differently, every society is founded according to that society's understanding of the human person. So if we have, for example, an Enlightenment understanding of the human person as atomized individuals, you know, we are all, you know, solitary, then we're not going to have a happy view of one another, are we? And society and the common good will just be viewed as a concession, not as something essential to who we are. Rousseau and Hobbes, both in different ways and for different reasons, had the view of the human person as an individual, an atomized individual, and did not view society as a good. It was something necessary, either imposed upon people or people needed to concede it. That's not going to give you a happy view of society. That will lead to totalitarianism, as it did. And that's not the Catholic understanding of the human person. Our understanding is that we are to live in society, and living in society is actually good for each of us individual. So again, the Catechism, society is not for the human person an extraneous addition, but a requirement of his nature. Through the exchange with others, mutual service and dialogue with his brethren, man develops his potential. He thus responds to his vocation. And so we realize the fulfillment of who we are to be by living in society. Our human nature requires that. And society needs to be based on the truths of our human nature. And it is the church's articulation of those truths and of this principle that I think are so important right now. Let me take it a bit further, again, drawing from the Catechism. This is an extraordinary statement, and it shows how much the church, how highly it regards society, the secular society, and how much it expects of secular society. There is a certain resemblance between the union of the divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the fraternity that men are to establish among themselves in truth and love. That's an amazing statement. And it's not just referring to the church, it's referring to society. That the more we are able to live in union with one another, in truth and in love, the more we serve as an image of the Trinity, of that oneness and that union of persons that is the triune God. That's a very lofty view of society, and that is one that we should foster and promote. And so I hope that these things can provide some ways of thinking for us as we can think of a way forward. How do we resolve these conflicts? How do we find our way back to something, to some foundation for unity in order to heal divisions? The church has an obligation to this, both by example and just being more herself, being more a gathering of people, the people of God who are one in truth, in the sacraments, and in governance, but diverse within all of that. And second, the church also helps us in her teaching and articulating that truth of the human person that always needs to serve as the basis of society and the principle of unity within society. I'll close with just a word about how our Lord sort of exemplifies this in the famous scene of his encounter with the Samaritan woman. And John, in telling that story, makes it very clear that Jews have nothing to do with Samaritans. It's kind of a blunt statement. And it should also, by the way, that blunt statement should, again, remind us that the divisions we see are not new in the human experience. And the bad blood between the Jews and Samaritans was probably, a lot worse than what we see. Our nation at least struggles with these things. What happens in that interaction with our Lord and the Samaritan woman? The first thing he says to her is not, "You're a Samaritan." The first thing he says to her, it kind of sounds rude, right? He says, "Give me a drink." But really what that speaks of is something that they have in common, right? They're both at the well for a reason, water. He speaks of something that is fundamental to all human experience, right? We need to be hydrated. And so he begins with what they both have in common. Now, he knows where he wants to go with this conversation. He's God, after all. But he doesn't begin with her sinfulness, what she's done wrong. He doesn't begin with the division between them. He begins with what is common. And from that, the conversation goes on. And within that context of this shared need for water, within that context is this dialogue about the division between Jews and Samaritans, the desire, God's intention to bring all into one, and then also what divides her from God, her sinfulness. But he doesn't lead with the divisions or her sinfulness. That's not his starting point. His starting point is, what do we have in common? And so there's the great ancient Roman playwright and former slave Terence famously said, I am a man. I don't consider anything human foreign to me. And although I should probably end with the gospel, not with a pagan playwright, I'll conclude there, and thank you for your attention. I think we have some time for Q&A. Yes, sir.
I'll start with listening to talk about the idea of university and then looking at our nation, which is in this climate of a lot of division, etc. I'm wondering if you might speak to the relationship that your father had with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and tie that into that concept of
Okay.
obviously they found some kind of unity,
Sure.
even with very different approaches.
Yeah.
to the,
Very much on my mind, yeah. So, spoiler alert, my dad was Justice Antonin Scalia, okay? So, he died 4 years ago. His very close friend and colleague for many years, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, died last Friday. My brother and I and one of my father's former clerks did a panel discussion last Thursday, a week ago today, so the day before she died. My brother and I knew she was dying, but I don't, it wasn't public knowledge. In that panel discussion, my brother and I, kind of told some stories, and that my parents and Marty and Ruth Ginsburg were close friends for decades, many, many years. It wasn't just my dad and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was also my mom and Marty Ginsburg, Ruth's wife, or Ruth's husband. And it was very much a friendship of the couples. And they spent every New Year's Eve together for decades. My brother Gene wrote a piece for the Washington Post on this. My brother Chris wrote for somewhere else. You can read those if you want to not listen to me. But they, as the years went by, some of my siblings would be invited to the New Year's revelries with their spouses. And so it's just kind of extended out, which is the way friendship should be, right? Friendship should actually, extend outward. Those get-togethers would go really late. At least once, I got home from New Year's parties before my parents did. And I was in high school. So their friendship was it was, I think, based on, some things that are common for all people. My mom and Marty Ginsburg loved to cook. My dad liked to eat. So that was good. And my brother Chris, I had forgotten this, but he pointed out that my dad would go on these hunting trips, and he'd bring back like wild boar or something like that. And Marty Ginsburg would prepare it, and they would have a lot of fun. Like, here, I brought this. What can you do with it? And so they would have a lot of fun as couples, and that they traveled together on occasion. My dad and Ruth both loved the opera. And so at one point, the Washington Opera, I think it was the Washington Opera, invited them to serve as extras in one of the operas. And there's a kind of somewhat famous picture of the two of them, all dressed up as, makeup and everything like that, and these, ridiculous opera outfits, right? But that was, it was kind of a great thing. These people from two opposite ends of the spectrum in legal matters were able to really have an affection for one another and have a genuine friendship. It was, their disagreements were more juridical, I would say, and legal than they were political. Everybody leaps to the political. This is a very bad habit in our culture. And the more religion recedes from our culture, the worse it gets. Because we're religious creatures. We will have a religion. And if it's not like actually a religion, it will be politics. Or sports. Or the economy. But for many people in our country, it's becoming politics. Their disagreements were more in terms of legal reasoning. And they would argue about this. My mom told me like one time, one New Year's Eve party went till 4 in the morning, and they were arguing about the Second Amendment. I mean, yeah, I have strong feelings about the Second Amendment, but, not till 4 in the morning. So again, it was taking what is natural and common to all of us and sort of building on that and not letting the other things divide. And so, yeah, it was, I think, a great example. And Jeff Sutton, one of my dad's former clerks, told a story about when he was visiting my dad's chambers one time, and he saw 24 roses on a table in my dad's office. And he said, what's that all about? He thought to himself, in all my years of marriage, I've never given that many flowers, like all together. And my dad said, oh, it's Ruth's birthday. I've got to bring those down the hall to her. And Jeff teased him and he said, what has this gotten you? In all of the crucial 5-4 decisions of the court, has she ever come your way? And my dad laughed and said, well, no, but some things are more important than votes. And so I think that's a great tribute to their friendship. Yeah. My brother Gene makes a point, by the way, and I think this is important. The takeaway from their friendship is not that by becoming friends we will then find ourselves in agreement. That's actually not the point, because they never did agree on some very important things. So, other questions? Yes.
So, I mean, back to their relationship, though. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was Jewish. Did they ever speak on religion that you remember?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I did not interact with her as much as some of my older siblings did. I was never invited to, the New Year's parties that were for couples, right, for obvious reasons. But I don't know that, and I don't. My dad was he was very intense about his faith. He was intense about everything, but no, he was very serious about his faith, and I don't know how her practice of the faith of her faith. So I think one of the things that they both appreciated about each other, so they're both New Yorkers, and I think a New York Catholic and a New York Jew have a lot in common, and I think they kind of appreciate one another. There's a picture I ran across after my dad died. He'd been invited to address like an Orthodox Jewish group, and it's the funniest picture, and it could really only happen in New York City. He is standing giving a speech, and if you've seen pictures of him, listen, if you didn't know that he was a Supreme Court justice, you might think that he's a mobster, right? And behind him are all of these Orthodox Jewish rabbis with the locks of hair and the hats, and they're all kind of like listening very intently to what he's saying. I'm like, that is such a great picture. My dad, he gave a lot of talks on faith, which kind of, I was like, hey, that's my shtick, But he gave a lot of talks on faith, and he really saw that as a responsibility that he had. He did not incorporate faith into, he's very vocal about saying he doesn't bring his faith into his decisions. He just makes the decisions as a lawyer, as a judge. But he did speak about his faith to different groups throughout the country for years, and not just Catholic groups. After he died, I received in the mail a box of Qurans, little Qurans for every member of my family. And I've got a big family. And it was some Muslim group that was just kind of edified by his public witness to faith and said, maybe you'd appreciate this. So I thought it was a wonderful gesture. But to your question, I don't know how much they spoke about faith. Okay. Yes?
What would be some practical steps towards helping our parishes come back, to this unifying principle of the gospel that you're talking about in this political election season, in all of the things that are tearing us apart?
Yeah. I think stick to the basics. What I see at my parish is listen, the Eucharist is our the baptism is really a principle of unity, and the Eucharist forms us into the body of Christ, right? And so sticking to those things, and the more we emphasize that unity, the more we can appreciate that diversity. And I don't want to say that we never discuss the difficult things, but I think the more that we allow politics to infiltrate them, then what happens is, and it doesn't mean that we're not concerned about those things, But I'm afraid that in a lot of instances, we allow the political and the secular to distract us from what makes us us. And this is the most important, one of the most important things about the church is that it's not a human creation. It really comes from the heart of God and is meant to reflect Him. And so, in order for us to really heal those divisions, it first of all needs to be a return to the fundamentals, and principally baptism and the Eucharist. And I think just also the attitudes of welcoming, welcoming others. It's kind of a very difficult time because, again, everything is so politically charged. But trying to set those things aside and cease suspicion. Maybe a good thing is to consider the history of the church and the diversity of the church throughout the world, and in our nation too. It's funny because in our nation, I don't know about out here, but certainly on the East Coast, it's all Irish. The Irish really sort of because they came here speaking English. They had a leg up. And so I think the perspective of a lot of people, at least on the East Coast, is that it's really the Irish really kind of built up the Church of the United States. And you get to other parts of the U.S., it's like, no, it's the Germans. Several years ago, I was in Denver around the Feast of St. Patrick, and Archbishop Aquila did not. It fell on a Friday during Lent. He did not dispense everybody from the Friday mortification. And I said, wow, you could get away with it. And he said, out there, the Irish didn't really build up the church. Now, you couldn't get away with that in New York City. Like New York and Boston, the Archbishop, he has to do that, But, and then, the Hispanics who, built up the church in certain areas of the country and are rebuilding the church in most other areas of the country and coming to appreciation of that. But always beginning again, okay, what unifies us? What do we have in common here? Because if we begin with what we have different, then it's harder to get back to the center. Yeah, so I think, that, again, the sacraments and the creed, these things, what makes us Christians and what we believe as Christians. Yeah. Great, and I think taking consolation in knowing that this is not the first time. And that's why reading the New Testament is, what's why were deacons ordained, right? Do you remember why deacons were ordained? Because the Greeks were being neglected in the daily distribution of bread. So you already had this ethnic tension in the first years of the church. So there's a consolation in knowing this is not the first time we've encountered this. And going back, how did they resolve it? And it was by focusing on what is common to all. Yes?
I was going to make a random connection, but you said you graduated from Holy Cross.
Yes.
And my uncle went to Holy Cross.
Okay.
Back in the late 60s.
Yeah, that was...
He would hitchhike
from Kansas.
For holidays.
Hitchhike from... That's the 60s. Yeah. He may have been there with Justice Clarence Thomas. Yeah, he was there. He was in the late 60s, so good. Wonderful. Good to be with you. Thank you so much for your hospitality and attention.